I worked the overnight shift at a mid-sized hotel in my hometown. Most nights the job was painfully quiet. My station was the front desk, and during the late hours there usually wasn't much for me to do besides watch the entrance, answer the occasional phone call, and help the few guests who happened to come in or leave. I had gotten used to strange people. Hotels attract all kinds. But there was one night I still think about whenever I have to work alone. It was raining heavily that night, not just a light shower either. The storm outside was loud enough that I could hear rain hammering against the glass doors from behind the desk. Because of the weather, the lobby was almost completely empty. I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a man walk through the first set of entrance doors. He stopped between the two doors. He didn't come inside. Instead, he just stood there. For several seconds, he looked around the lobby as if he were trying to memorize the layout. Then his eyes met mine. I gave him a polite smile. He didn't smile back. He simply reached into his pockets, checked something, and walked straight back outside into the rain. I watched him disappear through the glass. It was strange, but after working at a hotel for long enough, you learn not to question every odd thing people do. A few minutes later, the phone on my desk rang. The caller ID showed an outside number. I answered with the hotel's usual greeting. A man's voice immediately asked if I could help him bring his luggage inside. He said his car was parked somewhere in the front lot. I told him that wouldn't be a problem if he brought his vehicle up to the entrance. I could help him once he was under the awning. There was a long pause. Then he said,
"Okay."
He hung up. I got out from behind the desk and waited near the entrance. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He still hadn't brought his car around. Eventually, I stepped toward the doors and looked outside. The rain was coming down hard. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the opposite side of the parking lot. The same man from earlier. He raised one hand and waved at me. Then he pointed toward himself. He wanted me to walk over. Something about that immediately felt wrong. I had specifically told him to bring his car to the entrance so neither of us would have to walk through the storm. Why would he refuse? I shook my head and went back to the desk. I figured if he really needed help, he'd follow my instructions. A few seconds later, I heard the entrance doors open. I looked up. It was him. He had somehow crossed the entire parking lot incredibly fast. His clothes were soaked and he was breathing heavily. He walked straight toward the desk.
"I need help with my suitcase."
I repeated what I'd already told him. "Pull your car around front and I'll help you." He stared at me. Then he said he'd already taken the suitcase out of the car. That made my stomach tighten. "Do you have a room here?" I asked. His expression changed immediately. He looked almost offended.
"I just need you to come outside and help me."
I told him I couldn't leave the desk for that. He became increasingly irritated, insisting that his luggage was getting soaked. I finally told him that if he wasn't a guest and refused to check in, he needed to leave the property. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he turned around. As he walked out, he raised his hand and gave me the middle finger. The doors closed behind him. I watched him disappear into the rain. He never came back. The next morning, I told the day shift employees what happened. We checked the guest records. There was no reservation under his name. He had never checked in. He wasn't a guest. He had simply walked into the hotel during a storm and tried repeatedly to convince the only employee working overnight to walk alone across a dark parking lot with him. I still don't know what he wanted. And honestly, I don't want to know. Because sometimes the scariest part of an encounter isn't finding out what someone intended to do. It's realizing how easily things could have gone differently. That night, if I'd walked across that parking lot just because a stranger asked me to, I might never have made it back behind that front desk. And that's a thought that has stayed with me ever since. I don't take long road trips very often. Normally, if I have to travel somewhere far away, I'll take a plane. But a few years ago, a death in my family forced me to make a last-minute trip to see relatives, and flying wasn't an option. I had to drive nearly 10 hours. I packed enough clothes and supplies to stay for about a week and left early the next morning. For the first few hours, everything was fine. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds appeared ahead of me, and within an hour, I was driving through heavy rain and constant thunder. The highway stretched through huge open fields and patches of forest. In some areas, the road dipped into low valleys where rainwater collected faster than it could drain. I slowed down considerably. At one point, I reached a section of road that was completely flooded. There was no way I could safely cross it. I turned around and took another route. That detour cost me a lot of time. By the time I'd been driving for nearly 8 hours, I still had several hours left. The sun was disappearing, the rain wasn't letting up, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I knew I needed to stop. Eventually, I came across a tiny town. Calling it a town was almost generous. There were only a handful of buildings, a few houses scattered around, and several dark streets. I drove around looking for somewhere to stop. There wasn't a motel. There wasn't a gas station that was open. Eventually, I found a small grocery store parking lot. I parked toward the far end, away from the road. The place was almost completely deserted. No cars, no people. Only a few streetlights glowing through the rain. I locked my doors, checked my surroundings, and leaned my seat back. I figured I'd sleep for an hour and continue once I felt rested. The sound of rain against the roof put me to sleep surprisingly quickly. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, something had changed. The storm had become much louder. Thunder shook the car. Lightning flashed across the sky. I wiped the condensation from the window and looked outside. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed movement. Someone was walking through the parking lot. A person was coming toward my car. I watched them carefully. They didn't seem to be heading toward the store. They weren't walking toward the road. They were coming directly toward me. As the figure got closer, I realized it was a man. He was completely soaked from the rain, but he didn't seem bothered by it at all. He kept walking. I locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. The man reached my car. I expected him to knock on the window. He didn't. Instead, he walked around to the back passenger door. Then he placed both hands flat against the car. For a second, I didn't understand what he was doing. Then he started pushing. He was trying to move my car. At first, I thought he might be drunk or confused, but he kept pushing, hard. His shoes slid across the wet pavement while he leaned his entire body against my car. I sat frozen in the driver's seat. I didn't want to roll down the window. I didn't want to speak to him. I just watched. Finally, I decided I needed to leave. I put the key into the ignition and started the engine. The headlights came on. The man didn't react. He continued pushing. I shifted into reverse and slowly began backing away. The man followed the car. For a few seconds, he actually kept his hands against the back door while I moved. Then he finally stopped. He stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched me. I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I kept driving until the tiny town was far behind me. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't stop thinking about him. What was he doing in that parking lot? Why did he approach my car? Why did he try to push it? And most importantly, why didn't he react when I started the engine? I've tried coming up with explanations. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he thought my car was blocking something. But none of those explanations make me feel better. Because there was one detail that bothered me more than anything. He had walked through a nearly empty parking lot during a violent storm specifically toward my car. He didn't ask for help. He didn't knock. He didn't say a word. He simply tried to push my car. And I still have no idea what would have happened if I'd opened that door and asked him what he wanted. I grew up in a remote part of Washington state, in a house surrounded by thick forest. Our nearest town was about 20 minutes away, and our closest neighbors lived nearly half a mile from us. I had lived there my entire life, so being isolated never really bothered me, until I was 14. It happened during spring break. My parents had originally planned a trip to Florida, and we were supposed to leave early Sunday morning. But a problem came up at my dad's job, forcing us to cancel the trip. Instead, my parents took me to a nearby water park. We spent several hours there, but by the afternoon, a massive storm began moving toward us. Everyone started leaving. By the time we got home, the storm had completely arrived. Rain slammed against the house, thunder shook the windows, and lightning constantly lit up the forest around us. As soon as we pulled into the driveway, something caught my dad's attention. The garage door was open. My dad assumed he'd forgotten to close it. My mom disagreed. She was certain she'd watched it close before we left. Still, nothing else appeared wrong. We went inside. My parents sat down in the living room while I headed upstairs to my bedroom. Halfway up the stairs, I thought I heard something moving upstairs. I stopped. The sound disappeared. I continued walking. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. My bedroom lights were on. I immediately knew I hadn't left them on. I stood outside the door, staring at the light underneath it. For some reason, I suddenly didn't want to open the door. I listened. Nothing. Then I heard a faint shuffling sound. It sounded like something moving around inside. I thought maybe an animal had gotten into the house. I slowly pushed the door open. Nothing was there. My room looked completely normal. I checked underneath my bed. Nothing. I looked behind some boxes. Nothing. Eventually, I sat down on my bed. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining things. Then a shadow moved across the bottom of my bedroom door. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall. Someone was standing in the hallway. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and immediately texted my dad. Someone is upstairs. A few seconds later, I heard my dad coming up the stairs. He opened my door. I whispered what I'd seen. He could tell from my face that I wasn't joking. Without saying much, he told me to stay behind him. We slowly walked down the hallway. We reached the stairs. Then we heard it. Something had slammed against the floor upstairs. A second later, footsteps exploded down the hallway. Someone was running. My dad grabbed a small baseball bat from beside the living room furniture. We rushed downstairs. The footsteps came down the stairs behind us. Then the front door suddenly swung open. We turned. A man was running away from our house. He disappeared into the trees. My dad immediately called 911. Because of how remote our house was, officers didn't arrive for almost half an hour. They searched the property, checked the house, and questioned all of us. They never found the man. But later, my parents realized something that made the whole situation even worse. Someone had known we were supposed to leave for Florida that weekend. They had known exactly when our house would be empty. The open garage, my bedroom lights, the sounds upstairs. It seemed like the person had entered our house expecting nobody to be there. And when we unexpectedly came home, he hid. I've spent years thinking about that night. The worst part isn't that someone broke into our house. It's the possibility that the person who did it knew our family well enough to know when we would be gone. To this day, I sometimes wonder who knew about our vacation. Because whoever that person was, they knew our plans. And they were already inside our house before we came home. I had lived in the same neighborhood for almost 6 years, so I knew most of the people who lived around me. It was a quiet suburban area outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing about it was particularly interesting. Most of the houses looked nearly identical. The streets were usually empty after midnight, and the biggest complaint anyone ever had was someone leaving their trash cans out too long. The house directly across from mine had been empty for almost a year. The previous owners had moved away after selling it, but apparently the sale had fallen through. Since then, it had just sat there. The grass grew too long. The mailbox was overflowing, and every night the house was completely dark. I never thought much about it. That changed one Tuesday night. I had gotten home from work around 11:30 p.m. and was sitting on my couch watching TV when I noticed something through my living room window. A light. It was coming from the upstairs bedroom of the abandoned house. I immediately sat up. The light was only on for a few seconds before disappearing. I thought maybe someone had finally bought the place. The next morning, though, I checked the house again. There were no cars in the driveway, the grass was still overgrown, and the mailbox was still packed with old mail. I figured I'd imagined the light. Then, 3 nights later, it happened again. Same window, same brief flash of light. This time, I was certain I wasn't imagining it. I walked to my front window and watched the house. Nothing moved. Then, I noticed something else. The front door was slightly open. I stared at it for several seconds. I knew that door had been shut before. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to be the guy reporting a slightly open door on an empty house. So I went to bed. Around 2:15 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. 3 knocks. I sat up. A few seconds passed. Then, 3 more knocks. I walked downstairs. The sound seemed to be coming from my front door. I looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. I opened the door slightly. The porch was empty. Then I noticed something lying on the ground. A small envelope. There was no name on it. I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. 4 words were written on it. "Stop watching my house." My stomach dropped. I immediately looked across the street. The abandoned house was completely dark. I closed and locked my door. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called the police. An officer came by and checked the property. He walked around the house but didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry. He told me it was probably a prank. I wanted to believe him. Then he asked me something that made my blood run cold.
did you know someone was inside that house?
I told him about the upstairs light. He looked at me strangely. Then he said,
The electricity has been disconnected for 8 months.
I didn't know what to say. That night, I kept every light in my house on. At around midnight, I looked across the street again. The upstairs window was glowing. But this time, I noticed something standing behind it. A person. They were completely motionless, just standing there, watching my house. I stepped away from the window. Then my phone vibrated. I had received a text message from an unknown number. There was only one sentence. Why did you call the police? I immediately locked my doors. Then I heard something outside, a faint, metallic sound, like someone was testing my front door handle. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The handle moved again, slowly, then stopped. The police arrived several minutes later. They searched my property but found nobody. One officer walked across the street and entered the abandoned house. A few minutes later, he came back outside. He looked confused. He told me there was nobody inside, but then he showed me something he'd found upstairs. A chair. It had been positioned directly in front of the window facing my house, and sitting on the chair was a pair of binoculars. The police took them as evidence. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up and noticed something taped to my front door. It was a photograph. I picked it up. My hand started shaking. It was a picture of me, sleeping. The photograph had been taken through my bedroom window. On the back, someone had written, "You should have kept your curtains closed." I moved out of that house 2 days later. The police never figured out who had been watching me. They never found the person responsible. And the abandoned house was eventually demolished. But there's one thing I still think about. The photograph wasn't taken from across the street. The angle was wrong. It was taken from much closer, from inside my backyard, which means that while I was standing at my window, watching that empty house, someone had already been standing behind my house, watching me.